Welcome to the Gaming Co-op Take the Point. I'm Eric, aka Sparkalaphobia, and I'll be your host today as I walk you through my favorite part of Hearthstone, deck building. With practice, deck building can give a huge edge in ranked mode, allowing you to hit high ranks and even high legend with fun and original decks. In this video, I'm going to be going over deck building start to finish, including picking a deck idea, mana curve, choosing the right cards, and teching and refining your deck, so that by the end of this video, you can start building your own innovative and awesome decks. Let's get started. The first thing you'll need to do is pick a deck idea. There are plenty of ways to come up with a deck idea, but most decks will revolve around one of two things. The first, and the easiest when you're new to deck building, is a theme. A theme can be anything from a minion type like beasts, pirates, or murlocs, or it can be a shared mechanic like healing, stealth, or death rattle. Theme decks can be very powerful because they have built-in synergy, but are only as strong as the cards for that theme that are in rotation. The second is picking an archetype. The 5 most common archetypes in Hearthstone are aggro, mid-range, control, tempo, and combo. Aggro decks are all about going face. Rather than trying to play the long game, these decks are stacked with early game cards and typically don't have anything more expensive than 5 mana. This allows them to quickly play out all of their cards and hopefully overwhelm their opponent. Aggro decks usually win based off of whether they've lost or won the game within a couple of turns of running out of cards in hand. Mid-range decks are slightly higher curving than aggro decks. They still have lots of early game, but rather than looking to play out as many cards as fast as possible, they tend to want to play the best single card possible each turn. By playing one quality card per turn, mid-range decks are able to keep up continuous pressure until they eventually close out with some form of burst. Control decks are all about survival. They typically have multiple big threats or card advantage tools to be able to outvalue the opponent in a drawn-out game. They will most often aim to just remove their opponent's minions and heal until at least turn 6 or later. Tempo decks are decks that run a lot of cards that are intended to specifically be used in combination with one another. These cards are often too expensive or too weak to run on their own, but become much more powerful when used together. These decks will often play a very controlling early game and mid game until they reach a point where they have enough mana to combine their cards for maximum effect. Lastly are combo decks, which play like control decks for most of the game, but instead of playing out powerful minions or value cards, they play combinations of cards that deal a tremendous amount of damage either in a single turn or over the course of a very small number of turns. In addition to those 5 common archetypes, there are also mill and fatigue decks, but because those decks are so niche and dependent on the specific cards and metagames, I won't be going over them in this video. Once you picked an archetype to build your deck around, the next step is to have an idea of what you want your mana curve to look like. If you started with a theme, then find the archetype that best matches how you think your theme will play out. Aggro decks curve out low with around 14 to 16 cards that cost 1 to 2 mana, 10 to 12 cards that cost 3 to 4 mana, and 4 to 6 cards that cost 5 or more mana. Your mana curve should peak somewhere around 1.5 mana and fall off after that. For mid-range decks, you want around 10 to 12 cards at 1 to 2 mana, 11 to 13 cards at 3 to 4 mana, and 5 to 7 cards that cost 5 or more mana. Your mana curve should peak somewhere around 3 mana. Control decks curve a bit higher than mid-range decks, with around 8 to 10 1 to 2 mana cards, 10 to 12 3 to 4 mana cards, and 7 to 9 cards that cost 5 or more mana. Your curve should peak somewhere around 4 mana. The curves for combo and tempo decks can vary heavily depending on the cards that they intend to combine, but usually have curves somewhere between aggro and tempo. It's important to note that these mana curves are just rough guidelines, and it's okay if your deck doesn't match the numbers perfectly, but most decks will have numbers that fall within those ranges. Also important to note is that a class's hero power and cards can influence its mana curve. For example, aggro, warlock, and hunter decks tend to curve lower because they want to use their hero powers often. As for deck composition, this next table shows roughly how many of each type of card you should include in your deck. You can also combine archetypes or add secondary win conditions to your deck. This can allow you to win matchups that you normally wouldn't be able to. One famous example of this is Hybrid Hunter, which runs an aggro hunter shell but includes Savannah Highmane to improve slower matchups. Not every alternate win condition will fit every deck, but don't be afraid to experiment if you notice you're struggling against a certain archetype and think an alternate win condition might help. Once you have an archetype and understand what your mana curve should look like, you're ready to start filling in your deck. Cards have 2 kinds of value. They have value as a standalone card or value within the context of your deck. Circle of Healing, for instance, has low value on its own, but if you have Akanai Soul Priest, Injured Blade Master, Northshire Cleric in your deck, it can wipe the board, give you an early lead, or draw a ton of cards. This is a table that shows how to value a card's standalone value. It can't tell you how strong a synergistic card like Circle of Healing can be in the right deck, but it's very useful, especially when building aggro and mid-range decks that tend to only play efficient standalone cards. Simply add all of the values on a card to get its point total. Once you've finished building your first deck, it's time to work on improving it. The best way to test a deck is by using a deck tracker, so that your testing is backed by hard data and doesn't get colored by emotion. Some trackers will even track cards played, so you can gather stats on performance of individual cards. Just tracking wins and losses should be plenty when you're getting started. The tracker that I use is Hearthstone Deck Tracker, but there are a few good options. Try to play around 20 games with the deck before making your first changes. Once you get to around 50 games with a specific version of a deck, you should have enough stats to know for sure which decks you're beating or losing to. If you're interested in doing more in-depth testing, I've also written a guide on testing and refining on Reddit, which I'll include a link to in the description below. Now you should have everything that you need to start building your first deck. If you like this video, please like and subscribe for more content. From one gamer to another, logging off.